In January 1773, a terrifying auditory hallucination shattered William Cowper's fragile mind with 5 definitive words: Actum est te, periisti, it is all over with thee, thou hast perished. Yet, from the depths of this perceived cosmic abandonment, the reclusive poet constructed a sanctuary of song that has comforted the brokenhearted for over 2 centuries. While Christian hymnody often celebrates narratives of triumphant faith, its architectural landscape is equally indebted to individuals acquainted with suffocating psychological darkness. The Anglican poet William Cowper, who lived from 1731 to 1800, stands as an extraordinary historical paradox. A man stripped of a traditional pulpit by a fracturing psyche, whose pen became an enduring instrument of global pastoral care. Cowper's life challenges the assumption that emotional stability is a prerequisite for spiritual utility. Instead, his severe clinical depression, acute anxiety, and intense spiritual paranoia served as the very channels through which his profound empathy flowed. Today, we dive into the historical, psychological, and theological investigation into Cowper's complex existence. It examines his early life, institutionalization, evangelical awakening, and his symbiotic partnership with John Newton, which birthed the seminal Olney hymns. Ultimately, we will demonstrate how Cowper translated private emotional exile into a corporate vocabulary of hope, proving that a mind can sit in absolute personal darkness while simultaneously illuminating the unshakable grace of God for the church. The foundations of William Cowper's adult psychiatric collapses were laid in early childhood trauma. The defining catastrophe occurred at age 6 with the death of his mother, Ann Dawn Cowper, a loss that severed his primary source of emotional regulation. This psychological void worsened when he was sent to boarding school, where he endured systematic, severe bullying. These early experiences instilled a pervasive expectation of hostility from the world, manifesting in young adulthood as a crippling defensive shyness. When Cowper moved to London to pursue a legal career, the aggressive public persona demanded by the profession triggered intense internal panic. His fragile ego perceived ordinary professional expectations as existential threats. Through a modern diagnostic lens, Cowper's alternating periods of intense literary productivity and catatonic despair strongly align with bipolar disorder or severe major depressive disorder with psychotic features. His episodes were characterized by profound cognitive distortions, somatic complaints, and acute persecutory hallucinations that manufactured an unshakable conviction of his cosmic isolation. Historically, contemporaries categorized his affliction as religious melancholy. 18th century frameworks heavily debated whether this condition arose from physical brain disease or an obsessive focus on Calvinistic doctrines of election and reprobation. While secular critics blamed his faith for his madness, Cowper's psychological vulnerabilities predated his evangelical conversion. Religion did not generate his illness. Rather, his malfunctioning mind seized upon theological language to articulate a pre-existing internal torment. The period of confinement within Dr. Nathaniel Cotton's asylum at St. Albans did not merely serve as a clinical quarantine, it became the unexpected crucible for a profound theological reorientation. Under Cotton's uniquely compassionate and spiritually sensitive care, Cowper's fractured psyche gradually stabilized. The decisive turning point arrived through a profound engagement with biblical texts, specifically the Pauline epistles, which presented a framework of unmerited mercy and justification by faith. This encounter shattered his prevailing perception of a purely punitive deity, replacing it with an intense evangelical apprehension of the benevolence of Jesus. This spiritual awakening injected a radical, unprecedented sense of hope into a mind previously defined by existential dread. The realization that divine acceptance was predicated on unmerited favor rather than personal performance directly counteracted the deep-seated inadequacies that had triggered his previous collapses. For a sustained period following this conversion, Cowper experienced a remarkable phase of emotional and theological equilibrium. The intrusive thoughts and paralyzing anxieties receded, replaced by a serene conviction of his inclusion in the divine family. This temporary golden age of mental peace demonstrated that, when properly integrated, his newfound faith acted as a powerful therapeutic anchor, offering a structured, benevolent reality that stabilized his volatile cognitive patterns. This fragile stability required an environment radically different from the high-pressure arenas of London, leading Cowper to relocate to the rural village of Olney in 1767. This geographical transition facilitated an immediate, intense proximity to the village curate John Newton, initiating one of the most celebrated and psychologically complex partnerships in literary history. The interpersonal dynamics between the two men presented a stark study in human contrasts. John Newton possessed a robust, resilient constitution forged in the brutal crucible of the Atlantic slave trade. He was a man of iron health, unshakable confidence, and vast social energy, comfortable navigating both maritime storms and ecclesiastical politics. While William Cowper remained a deeply reclusive, hypersensitive intellectual, structurally fragile, and continuously haunted by the specter of his past psychiatric breaks. Despite these glaring differences, their relationship developed into a deeply symbiotic alliance. Newton did not treat Cowper as a clinical liability or a passive object of charity. Instead, he recognized the profound intellectual and spiritual depths hidden behind the poet's hesitant demeanor. Newton engaged in a deliberate pastoral curation of Cowper's mind, structuring the poet's daily life to ward off the dangers of solitary rumination. This curation was achieved by immersing Cowper in the active, practical duties of the parish. Newton brought the reclusive poet into the communal life of Olney through collaborative prayer services, visits to the impoverished lacemakers of the district, and organized poor relief efforts. By demanding that Cowper focus his energies outward onto the tangible sufferings of others, Newton provided a practical behavioral therapy that anchored the poet's mind. Furthermore, Newton recognized that Cowper's supreme gift lay in his literary prowess, and he systematically motivated him to channel his emotional insights into verse, laying the groundwork for a creative output that would survive both of their lifetimes. The psychological sanctuary at Olney was violently shattered in January 1773. Driven by a severe endogenous cyclical shift in his bipolar disorder, Cowper descended into a deep abyss of madness. The definitive event was a catastrophic dream featuring a vivid auditory hallucination that delivered a fatal decree. Actum est de te periste. It is all over with thee, thou hast perished. This absolute, unshakable conviction permanently rewired Cowper's reality. He became utterly persuaded that God had issued an exceptional individual edict of reprobation against him. His delusion was uniquely agonizing. He did not doubt Christian orthodoxy, nor Christ's capacity to save sinners. Rather, he believed he was the singular exception to universal grace. Explicitly excluded from the covenant, every waking moment was lived under the shadow of perceived divine hostility and cosmic abandonment. The practical consequence of this delusion was absolute spiritual expatriation. Convinced his presence insulted the deity who had damned him, Cowper withdrew entirely from public worship. For his remaining 27 years, he never again crossed the threshold of a church. Yet he maintained an unwavering intellectual commitment to Calvinist theology, defending the doctrines of grace and election for everyone else, while viewing himself as a unique cosmic castaway. During these prolonged cycles of catatonia and recurring suicide attempts, Cowper's survival depended on a sacrificial network of domestic care. The widow Mary Unwin provided monumental endurance, tending him through states of acute terror and refusing food. Alongside Unwin, John Newton remained fiercely loyal, enduring erratic outbursts and transforming their home into an informal psychiatric ward. Though Cowper was severed from internal divine comfort, he remained surrounded by the tangible earthly manifestations of grace through his companions. The genesis of the Only Hymns was an intentional pastoral intervention designed by John Newton to rescue his friend William Cowper's disintegrating mind. Recognizing that solitary reflection was Cowper's most dangerous enemy, Newton engineered a collaborative project to compel the poet to engage his creative faculties toward a communal purpose, providing a therapeutic channel to externalize his inner torment. Integrated into the weekly prayer meetings of the only parish, these hymns instantly transformed Cowper's raw, private confessions of doubt into corporate expressions of worship. When the local laborers lifted their voices to sing his words, they reframed his psychological exile within a supportive context. Cowper's private grief provided an authentic vocabulary for the corporate church, allowing others experiencing their own dark nights of the soul to find solidarity. Within this collection, several masterworks emerge that illustrate how Cowper translated his internal agony into timeless theological comfort. There is a fountain filled with blood, the absolute, unchanging efficacy of Christ's redeeming blood, assures the listener that no amount of mental decay or cognitive distortion can diminish the objective power of salvation. God moves in a mysterious way. The absolute sovereignty and hidden providence of God behind painful providences validates the reality of internal darkness while assuring the sufferer that God's true face is full of grace even when hidden behind a terrifying facade. In There is a Fountain Filled with Blood, Cowper projects an absolute efficacy onto Christ's sacrifice that could overcome the deepest human decay, including a broken mind. Even while feeling personally excluded from its benefits, his intellect insisted that the fountain remained sufficient to redeem a fractured consciousness. In God Moves in a Mysterious Way, written during encroaching madness, Cowper tackles divine hiddenness, writing, "Judge not the Lord by feeble sense. Behind a frowning providence he hides a smiling face." He challenges the reliability of human emotions, asserting that a malfunctioning mind cannot accurately perceive the Almighty's intentions. By decoupling divine benevolence from subjective emotional states, he provided a lifeline for generations of suffering believers. To fully understand Cowper's contribution, one must observe how he intentionally inverted the triumphant nautical imagery favored by Newton. While Newton drew from his past as a slave ship captain to depict storms as external threats yielding to dramatic rescue, Cowper subverted this paradigm. For the fragile poet, the sea was a swallowing abyss of isolation. His metaphors shifted to a sailor drowning just outside the reach of safety, clinging to a hidden anchor amid an internal psychological deluge. This castaway motif allowed Cowper to speak uniquely to those who identified not with victorious overcomers, but with the sheer exhaustion of survival. As the illusion of his eternal damnation became permanent, Cowper turned to secular deflections as a form of cognitive behavioral therapy to prevent catatonic despair. He embarked on massive translation projects, including Homer, Ovid, and Madame Guyon, deliberately consuming his intellectual energy to stave off persecutory hallucinations. This period unexpectedly vaulted Cowper to the peak of the English literary canon. The publication of his masterpiece The Task, 1785, and the comic verse John Gilpin brought national acclaim. The historical irony was immense. The verses providing a tranquil escape for the public were constructed as a psychological shield against mental collapse. Even John Gilpin, which caused audiences to weep with laughter, was written during a night of paralyzing depression to distract himself from suicide. The fragile scaffolding supporting Cowper dissolved in 1796 with the death of Mary Unwin, his primary emotional anchor. Her passing plunged him into an irreversible descent into absolute psychological darkness and cosmic isolation. This final chapter is epitomized by his bleak last poem, The Castaway, 1799, where he compares his suffering to a drowning mariner, concluding, "We perished, each alone." When Cooper died in 1800, he was utterly convinced he was an outcast from divine mercy. The ultimate paradox, William Cooper successfully illuminated the unshakable grace of God for the global church while sitting in absolute personal darkness. Cooper shatters the notion that spiritual utility requires a healed mind. He ministered not from a pulpit of certainty, but from an enduring emotional exile, translating private agony into a corporate language of comfort. History reveals that by anchoring his profound intellectual gifts to an honest expression of human weakness, his pen achieved a reach few traditional pulpits could match, proving that the cracks in a vessel can serve as the very apertures through which healing light is diffused. The profound paradox of William Cooper's life forces us to re-examine our contemporary understanding of weakness, capability, and divine purpose. We routinely assume that a mended mind is a prerequisite for deep spiritual utility, yet history proves that a broken vessel can diffuse brilliant light to a fracturing world. It is entirely possible to stand in personal, agonizing darkness while simultaneously serving as a beacon of unshakable hope for those around you. If our psychological fractures can actually become the primary channels for deep human empathy, why do we remain so obsessed with presenting a flawless facade to the world? In what ways might your own deepest personal impairments be the exact spaces where your most enduring contributions are currently being forged? Join us next week as we dive into John Dagg, the blind and lame theologian. We will continue our video series, Beyond the Barrier, Preachers Who Defied Their Limits, by exploring how this monumental figure navigated severe physical disabilities to construct some of the most influential theological treatises of his era, proving once again that physical limitation is no barrier to systemic impact. Engage with the community. If you found value in this deep historical and theological analysis, please subscribe to Theology Today. By joining this digital channel, you help us continue to produce high-quality instructional visualizations and deep historical narratives that bring the forgotten stories of church history to life.